I want you to picture a child's bedroom where the dust on the floor contains enough lead to cause brain damage. Imagine a playground where simply breathing can lead to convulsions and even death. This is not imagination for the people of Kabwe, Zambia. It's their daily reality. Across the world in London, shareholders recently gathered for Anglo American's AGM, expecting to discuss profits and dividends. Instead, they face Lydia, a woman whose own child carries the scars of decades of lead poisoning. Her community's blood lead levels are 20 times higher than those that caused international outrage in Flint, Michigan. Today, we're sharing their fight for justice against a corporation that allegedly knew it was poisoning children, but decided that cleaning up was too expensive. In this episode, we cover the betrayal of Kabwe's people in Zambia, who are dealing with the toxic fallout of colonial capitalism. We'll talk about how a colonial corporation is being held responsible for poisoning this community, and the uphill battle of the around 140,000 people who have taken Anglo American to court in order to save their children, get justice, and get their community cleaned up. So stay tuned. By the way, if you see me playing with my phone, it's not because I'm distracted mid-recording session. This is how it helps with the production currently. And on that note, the Decolonial Center is looking for a producer. You can find more information about that on our LinkedIn page. Go check that out. Let's go back to 2021. Dr. Ian Lawrence comes forward as an important witness decades after Anglo American management gave him the cold shoulder. Just a year prior, the law firm Lee Day, working with Johannesburg's attorneys Mubisa Molili, filed a class action lawsuit against Anglo American South African Limited in the Gauteng division of the South Africa High Court. The case was brought by 13 representative claimants on behalf of all in Kabwe who may become pregnant and who live in the Kabwe district of Zambia and are children. The international press was following closely. The UN had sent its special rapporteurs. Every single human rights organization of repute expressed their support in seeing justice for the world's most poisoned town. This case is ongoing, and the claimants have clear demands. They want 1. Financial compensation, 2. Blood lead screening, and 3. The cleanup of their contaminated land. Now, this is what Dr. Ian Lawrence found himself in between. On the one side, a poisoned town seeking justice, and on another, a giant mining corporation, a corporation he once worked for. If any of you are nerds like I am, you're probably either thinking of the Shinra Corporation in Final Fantasy VII or the planet of Canary in Andor. But the problem is that this isn't fiction. The truth is more brutal than fiction sometimes. And Dr. Lawrence had to testify to what had been seen in this very real world we all had inhabit together. Standing on the podium, after the judge asked him about his tenure as the company's mine doctor during the late 60s and early 70s, Dr. Lawrence was forthcoming. I became deeply concerned at the number of deaths amongst children under the age of 5 in the residential township where local employees lived. The difference in the number of deaths between mine children and local children was reasonably significant, so much so that I could not understand why no one else had raised the issue or carried out an investigation. His testimony was key to linking the ongoing lead contamination that burdens the children of Kabwe today to the era of colonial mining, an era many have plausibly say, including myself, never come to an end. So, what do we know about soil and children? Children often play with soil. Sometimes they even put soil in their mouth. It is how they interact with the world that they're just getting to know. But in Kabwe, Zambian children are regular kids. They're also poison kids. And I mean really poisoned. In 2015, a scholar called Jonye Byabe and his Japanese team went to the mining town of Kabwe to investigate just how poisoned its children actually were. His team tested the blood lead levels of children who were under 7 with equipment that isn't immediately available in this impoverished area. They found that the mean blood levels were around 82.2 micrograms per deciliter of blood in the area of Kasanda in the town. Now, that number might not mean something to you, but it's actually high. It's crazy high. To be clear, scientists say that there is no safe level of lead in the blood. Lead in anybody's blood leads to all sorts of problems: physical pain, pregnancy problems, problems in neurological development, and even death. That said, the United States Center for Disease Control and Prevention does insist that a blood lead level of around 3.5 micrograms per deciliter should raise any government's alarm. Now I'm going to say that again. 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. That's what gets you poisoned. That's when public health actions and monitoring are activated. That's when everybody, not just the state, should panic. Now, in the mining town of Kabwe, according to the Children of Kabwe project, in the most affected townships, around half of the children up to 5 years old have a blood lead level higher than 45 micrograms per deciliter, and some have lead levels above 100 micrograms per deciliter. Now just remember what I said. 3.5 micrograms per deciliter is what it takes to be considered poisoned. Now some of these kids have 100 micrograms per deciliter, which can and does, by the way, lead to death. That's 12 to 35 times more than the CDC alarm levels. The soil in Kabwe contains lead concentrations so high that in any wealthy nation, it wouldn't just require immediate evacuation and hazardous waste treatment. It'd be treated like a national health disaster, not in the peripheries of capitalism. A UN Special Rapporteur has called it one of the world's worst sacrifice zones, a place where people are literally being left to die, or rather be killed by corporate toxic waste. Yes, Kabwe is the world's most toxic town. The lead in children's blood in Kabwe is about more than 20 times the levels seen in Flint, Michigan. And if you don't remember the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, a predominantly black sacrifice zone, it was seen as so severe that it led to a $626.25 million settlement for the affected community by the US government. In Kabwe, on the other hand, 140,000 children and pregnant women continue to be poisoned while Anglo American, the corporation they see as responsible, claims its innocence. The lead doesn't just stay in the ground, by the way. It coats homes, contaminates food, and enters developing brains where it causes irreversible damage. It causes miscarriages and birth complications. And the health impacts are nothing short of atrocious, with children and women hit the hardest. You see, because the bodies of kids are still developing. So they get about 4 to 5 times more lead ingestion than adults from the same amount of exposure to lead. The toxicity levels are so high, they are at the levels that bring about brain damage, kidney damage, convulsions, and even death. Pregnant women also have it really hard. Lead can be stored in their bones and then it leaks into the bloodstream. From there, it can cross into the placenta and damage the brain development of a child even before they're born. That's why 140,000 children and women of childbearing age are supporting this class action against Anglo American. And so if you were a parent, you'd be angry too, right? Not to mention that you'd probably also be poisoned yourself. That's why these groups from all across the world came to London in 2025 to intervene in Anglo American's general meeting. They did it for their children and they did it for themselves, because for far too long, the world has sacrificed them to the altar of profit. In fact, we spoke to Lydia from Kabwe. Here is what she had to say.
Every day, we are faced with this health risk, especially young children, because they are the ones that play outside in the soil. And it is this soil that also carries this lead contamination, and children are more risk of getting affected by lead contamination, and also young women of childbearing age, because let's say they get pregnant, they risk suffering miscarriages, and also it affects the development of the growing baby inside the womb. It won't grow normally because of the adverse effects of lead poisoning in Kabwe. So the experiences have been difficult for myself and the people in these hotspot areas For example, I can talk about my children. One of my younger children has been constantly affected by lead in that she suffers constantly from stomach pains. And because of the complaints that she would have, it prompted me to go to one of our local hospitals where a test was carried out on her. A scan actually was done on her stomach to ascertain what is wrong with her. So it was during this time that the scan revealed that the liver appeared to be slightly inflamed, and further tests were ordered on the liver, which they referred to as a pathology test, a liver pathology test, which revealed that 2 of the enzymes in her body were off balance. They were above the normal of what the normal range of what they were supposed to be. So after that, there's not much medical assistance that was given because of the capacity maybe of our healthcare systems. So the best advice I was given at the moment was just to focus on the diet. And then equally, my fellow women in the community also have similar problems. There's one woman I can talk about who has a son who has very high blood lead levels, that is above 50 milligrams per deciliter. That is very high for a human being or human body to contain, especially a child. So the problems in this home are that this child is of school-going age and is constantly not in school because of the health challenges that he faces. Most of the time he's unwell and he's home until such a time if he feels better, he would go to school. So his learning progression has been affected so very much because of the environment where he lives. And even younger children, you find that they're so forgetful. So now if a child is forgetful, how are they going to learn in class? Practically, they would forget maybe half of the things they learn. And then you may say that maybe children of Kabwe are not so intelligent. Well, no, they are intelligent, given a chance. If the environment where they lived is okay, they would progress so well in school and they would do well and their health would be okay. But because of the environment that they live in, they are constantly facing or having to breathe lead-polluted air. It's been a challenge for them.
If you're new here, please make sure to subscribe, like, and share so we can keep growing this movement. Decolonial Dispatch is brought to you by the Decolonial Center, where we believe in education as a tool for liberation. And this newscast is supported and sponsored by the Barry Emile and Norman Melbourne Trust. The Decolonial Center, of course sharing many of the same values of its sponsors, takes a completely independent editorial line. We appreciate your support, so please like and subscribe. Now, the story of Kabwe begins not with the lawsuit we just heard about, but with extraction, a system of colonial extraction which exists well into the present, where the peripheries of the world system are sources for metals, fossil fuels, and energy, and dumping grounds for toxic waste. The mine opened in 1902 during British colonial rule over what was then called Northern Rhodesia. But the critical turning point came in 1925 when Anglo American entered the picture and established formal lead mining operations. This wasn't just any mine. From 1925 to 1974, nearly 5 decades, the Broken Hill Development Company, allegedly controlled by Anglo American, extracted massive quantities of lead from Kabwe's earth. Anglo American today claims they held only a minority share in the operation, specifically just a 10% indirect share. This claim forms the centerpiece of their current legal defense. But examination of historical corporate records suggests a different reality. Anglo American reportedly maintained operational control over the mine during the exact period when scientists now estimate that 2/3 of the lead contamination, which the people of Kabwe still struggle with, happened. The corporation appointed key management, personnel, it directed technical operations, and maintained financial oversight. Their fingerprints appear throughout the mine's operational documents. Like any mine, that meant it had a whole residential world attached to it. Kitchens and cooks, laundromats and seamstresses, clinics, nurses and doctors. This was the late 60s and early 70s. People were conscious of the damage done to the environment. Green parties were being formed across the world. Anti-nuclear movements were blossoming in Europe. There was heightened awareness that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and not to corporations. People began to care about what corporate power was doing to our bodies and biosphere. The mine's lead doctor, Ian Lawrence, grew concerned about the number of deaths among the children he had been seeing in Kabwe, and so he went about to measure the blood lead levels of the children. Every test came out with the same result: alarmingly high levels of lead in the blood. This must have been a mistake, he probably thought to himself after the first test, so he tested more children. He confirmed this about 500 times, no change. The mine was poisoning children, pregnant women as well. And this wasn't just high, it was fatally high, as in blood levels that could cause brain damage and death. And it's hard to imagine how many children died from such afflictions with their parents not even knowing. Writing to the British Medical Journal from Gainsborough in England, another doctor known to have been working at the mine recounted, in some of the more unfortunate mannerisms of the time, that he had, open quote, recently returned from working as a medical officer for a lead smelting concern in a developing country, and was alarmed to find 6 unrelated African children under 5 years old who exhibited similar abnormal eye movements. In 5 of them, the condition progressed to convulsions, coma, and death, and the only survivor was mentally retarded. Again, this was the language they used at the time. They all lived within half a mile, 800 meters, of the smelter. The children were found to have a blood lead level between 60 and 154 micrograms per 100 milliliters of blood. The doctors were obviously horrified by this, and they knew why it was happening. The technology and scientific knowledge was quite adequate enough for them to hypothesize the cause of the lead poisoning. It was obviously the lead mine. Commercial profit was, once again, killing children. You see, lead is a profitable mineral. Common uses of lead include lead batteries, which are used in vehicles like cars, trucks, motorcycles, and for backup power storage. Cable sheathing is also used as a protective casing for electrical cables. Even weapons ammunition requires lead. But the process of extracting it is really hazardous. The physical layout of any lead extraction operation practically guarantees contamination of surrounding communities. The smelter stack in Kabwe stood less than a kilometer from residential areas where workers and their families lived. For decades, this stack belched lead-laden emissions directly over homes, schools, and communal spaces. The wind carried lead particles into people's lungs, onto their skin, into their food, and throughout their environment. And more troublingly, male tailings, the waste material from processing the ore, were often left exposed, creating vast zones of contaminated dust that spread with each gust of wind or rainfall. It's why the community of Kabwe is suing Anglo American. As Lydia told us,
we understand as a people of these hotspot areas of Kabwe that Anglo America is responsible for the lead contamination. And it was in 1924 up to about 1974 when they were in charge of the mine. And during their mining activities, as they were mining, they did not take care of the mine waste to dispose it properly. I feel Anglo America doesn't just want to own up for the responsibility in the environmental damage in Kabwe. They, if I may use the word, they want to bully their way out of this situation in Kabwe. And we have been trying as a people of Kabwe to get Anglo on board. They turned a deaf ear. And so the only means by which we could get Anglo's attention was through a class action.
You might be wondering why Lydia insists that Anglo American is bullying their way out of culpability. And for that, you have to understand a major hiccup that almost derailed the entire quest for justice in Kabwe. Now, at the meeting, at the annual general meeting, Lydia Moyo, yes, the same Lydia we talked to, and a proxy shareholder and mother from a village affected by Kabwe, spoke, and she asked why Anglo American was not addressing the ongoing suffering in Kabwe, especially since Anglo American South Africa allegedly knew about lead poisoning deaths in the 1970s. She was, of course, met with cold indifference. There was a kind of conventional, "We are sorry this is happening to you" statement made, but ultimately followed by a casual "this is not our problem." In fact, Richard Price, Anglo American's head of legal and corporate affairs, told South Africa's Business Times later that day that Anglo American South Africa should not be held legally responsible for the current situation in Kabwe. He said that those supporting the 140,000 claimants were basically in it for the money. This is the Anglo American line, by the way. They've said it multiple times. They argue that Lee Day and Mubisa Molili, UK and South Africa-based law firms respectively, were being driven not by justice, but because they wanted money. It goes without saying that communities fighting for their children's right to breathable air have found these attacks against their lawyers to be nothing short of insulting. It also doesn't help Anglo's case that human rights organizations and even the UN have been lining up to support the claimants' quest for justice. Despite what Anglo says, namely that this is about money, the claimants are actually being supported by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Southern African Litigation Center, and even a group of UN special rapporteurs, all of whom have joined as Amici Curiae, Friends of the Court, in August 2022. Yet that's not the end of the insult, because believe it or not, back in 2023, the South African High Court threw out the case. According to The Guardian, in a 126-page judgment delivered on the 15th of December, Justice Leonie Windel of the Johannesburg High Court said the applicants seek permission to advance an untenable claim that would set a grave precedent. The precedent is that a business could be held liable half a century after its activities have ceased to generations not yet born, as a result of being tested against future knowledge and standards unknown at the time. Okay, so take a deep breath with me. Yes, you read that right. The precedent in South Africa would be, if this was to win, that reparations is justified. That's what concerned her. I think you can connect the dots yourself. And another thing that the court said was that it didn't want to deal with the unmanageability of assessing claims for over 130,000 people. Worst of all, the claimants were pushed to pay Anglo American's costs. Anglo American, unsurprisingly, welcomed this decision. But this wasn't the end of the story. Because on April 19, 2024, the High Court of South Africa granted the claimants permission to appeal the dismissal of their certification application. Justice Leonie Windel, yes, the same judge, found that an appeal had reasonable prospects of success on at least one ground, and that there were compelling reasons to grant the appeal as class action law is developing in South Africa. And matters of public importance implicating constitutional rights were involved. At this point, you're probably wondering, how does Anglo American get away with this in court? Well, that's because Anglo American South Africa is basically saying that they never owned the mine, so they shouldn't be held responsible. You see, the company's defense rests on two primary arguments, each carefully constructed to create distance between Anglo American and the suffering in Kabwe. So first, they minimize the operational role, claiming that they only held a 10% indirect share in the mine. And second, they shift blame to the later state-owned operators who managed the mine after Zambian independence and who nationalized it. But lawyers for the claimants say, and convincingly show, that there's documentary evidence that Anglo was the operator when 2/3 of the lead contamination happened, and that their minority share claim is just a distraction from the fact that they were the ones who were calling the shots. Now, in either case, when Dr. Lawrence worked for the mine, it was called the Zambian Broken Hill Development Corporation. Although even back then, one could argue that it was known to many that Anglo was in charge. And that brings us back to 1970. Dr. Lawrence, as we explored earlier, was by then certain that 500 children, 500 unrelated to each other, had lead poisoning. Now, this can't be kept under the wraps. So he needed to take this up to the chief medical officer, who, to his great merit, went even further and commissioned a report from a Professor Lane and another Dr. King from the University of Manchester. These independent experts delivered a devastating assessment. After thorough examination of the affected children and environmental testing, they concluded the contamination was severe, widespread, and directly linked to the mine operations. Their recommendations were clear and uncompromising. The entire township needed to be moved and contaminated topsoil removed to prevent further poisoning. Now, this probably wasn't what Anglo wanted to hear. The world-renowned experts were painfully honest. Things were bleak. When Mr. Trevor Lee Jones, the Zambian Broken Hill Development Corporation general manager at the time, got the news, he responded in a memo that this would be far too expensive. They'd move as much as they can, but everyone else would have to live with the consequences. Now, the consequences of this decision were immediate and measurable. 8 children died in the next year. Deaths that might have been prevented had the experts' recommendations been implemented. Each funeral, mind you, represented not just a personal family tragedy, but the predictable outcome of a corporate decision to accept child death as an acceptable cost of doing business. This was what prompted another doctor at the mine, Dr. A.R.L. Clark, to write a thesis at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that would conclude in 1974. Therein, Dr. Clark found that in the township area of Kasanda, the mean blood lead levels of children were reported between 42 micrograms per deciliter to 104 micrograms per deciliter, while Makululu showed a mean range from 20 micrograms per deciliter to a high peak of 83 micrograms per deciliter. That too prompted no change, even as Anglo headed over the mine to the young independent state of Zambia. Perhaps what's most damning about all of this history is that it shows you the value placed on different human lives. When Anglo American rejected remediation as too expensive, they made an implicit judgment about whose lives merited protection, whose didn't. Children in a Zambian town were deemed expendable in ways that would have been unthinkable in London or Johannesburg, where the company's executives lived. This valuation of human life, according to geography, race, and colonial relationship, exposes the moral bankruptcy at the core of extractive capitalism. And I'm afraid that things haven't changed. 40 years later, a research group in 2018, including the researcher Boz O'Reilly, found that over 95% of children living in the most affected villages had blood lead levels greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter. These aren't just numbers. Every single one of these numbers represents a life. This is what Lydia told me.
Anglo American is not on the ground in Choa. They have been unavailable to address the concerns, the environmental concerns that my people in these hotspot areas are facing. So the only means by which we could get their attention was through the class action using the legal system. And their response was not something that we expected from them because they denied. They said they are not responsible for the environmental damage, which is not true. They are responsible. They are the ones who are in charge of the mine and largely responsible for the environmental damage that we're still facing even today, even though it's been 50 years since the time they left, but the effects are still there. Children are suffering. I can mention also that because the same lead-contaminated soil doesn't support agricultural activities, even the water that the people use to water these vegetables, it's also contaminated by the lead. So it's really a very difficult situation, something very hard to live with. And the response by Anglo has not been favorable so that we can be helped in this situation.
So what would justice actually mean after generations of poisoning for Kabwe's residents? The answer stretches far beyond financial compensation. The class action lawsuit against Anglo American, yes, articulates 3 core demands: financial compensations for victims, comprehensive blood lead level screening for the entire community, and the cleanup of the contaminated land. But these demands only form the foundation of what minimal accountability might look like. They address only the symptoms of a deeper colonial wound that continues to bleed across generations. These demands, while necessary, cannot restore lost lives, repair damaged brains, or recover generations of human potential erased by lead poisoning. No amount of money could compensate a child for the permanent cognitive damage that they've incurred without any fault of their own. No medical screening reverses decades of accumulated neurotoxins. No soil remediation can bring back the dead. Justice requires acknowledging these limitations, but still pursuing every single possible avenue for healing and restoration. The medical intervention for current residents would represent an urgent priority, and that cannot wait for all of these legal processes to conclude. Children in Kabwe require specialized treatment for lead poisoning, including chelation therapy to remove lead from their bodies. Pregnant women need particular attention, as lead stored in their bones leaches into their bloodstream during pregnancy, which poisons their unborn children before they even take their first breath. The intergenerational nature of lead poisoning means that addressing only current contamination ignores how this toxin transfers across generations, the way it's stored in mothers' bones, as a poisonous legacy of colonial extraction. The environmental remediation required in Kabwe is staggering when you think about it. Soil throughout residential areas contains lead concentrations hundreds of times above current safety limits, at least those recommended by the CDC in the United States. So effective cleanup demands removal and the replacement of contaminated soil across entire neighborhoods, the implementation of advanced water treatment systems, the establishment of ongoing environmental medical programs. This can't be a one-time project. It has to be a multi-decade commitment to healing the land that's been poisoned through decades of extraction. Multi-decade. The scale of remediation needed obviously reflects the UN's designation of Kabwe as one of the world's worst sacrifice zones. Genuine accountability would require Anglo American to acknowledge their role in creating this crisis, rather than continuing legal battles designed to evade responsibility. Justice for Kabwe demands more than addressing this specific case. It requires transformative justice that confronts the structural conditions which enable corporations to extract wealth while leaving poison behind. Transformative justice goes beyond compensating individual victims to challenge the systems that make such exploitation possible. It means abolishing the legal frameworks that allow corporations to escape responsibility for environmental harm. You know what? I'll go further. It means abolishing corporations. We need to prioritize human life over corporate profit. This means that we recognize that contamination isn't an unfortunate accident, but the predictable consequence of an extractive model which treats entire communities as disposable. The struggle in Kabwe connects directly to broader movements for decolonial reparations and environmental justice across the global south. Similar battles have unfolded in Nigeria's oil-contaminated Niger Delta, Ecuador's Lago Agrio region, and the occupied West Papua. These communities share a common experience of colonial extraction that has left behind it environmental devastation while transferring wealth elsewhere to shareholders, mainly in the global north. These struggles demonstrate the colonial logic that persists under racial capitalism, where wealth extraction remains prioritized over the well-being of black and brown communities. True justice for Kabwe would require not just compensation and cleanup, but the fundamental transformation of the systems that have allowed this poisoning to happen. It means acknowledging that Anglo Americans' actions in Kabwe weren't anomalous, but that they exemplified a colonial approach to extraction that treated African lives as expendable. It requires recognizing that the legal frameworks making corporate accountability so difficult emerged from colonial legal systems designed to protect corporate interests rather than colonized peoples. Justice means transforming these systems to serve human well-being rather than capital accumulation. Lydia's presence at the AGM represented the determination of Kabwe residents to be seen and heard, despite all attempts to silence them. When she stood before shareholders, as a proxy shareholder herself, she transformed that corporate meeting from a space of financial discussion, cold, miserable financial discussion, to a confrontation with colonial extraction's human consequences. Her voice, carrying years of community suffering, forced Anglo American executives to face the human impact of their corporation's historical actions. This act of resistance demonstrates how affected communities refuse to accept their designated role as sacrifice zones for corporate profit. The path toward justice for Kabwe offers lessons that extend far beyond Kabwe itself. It shows how colonial capitalism's toxic legacies continues to poison communities long after colonialism has ended, or formal colonialism has ended. It also demonstrates how corporate legal strategies maintain colonial power relations by making accountability for their colonial violence almost nearly impossible. And this then reveals the extraordinary determination of colonized communities who refuse to accept their disposability and insist on their right to clean soil, water, and air. This isn't about compensation alone. It's about the recognition of the people of Kabwe, and by extension, all of our full humanity, in a world that continues treating so much of us as expendable. And so we'll have to see what the Supreme Court of South Africa says. That's it for this episode of Decolonial Dispatch. And remember, decolonization is not a metaphor. So stay informed and stay engaged. If this report was valuable to you, please share it with your networks. And please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. As you can see, we're a very small channel and we're trying to take off here. But it takes a lot of work to do the research of these episodes, so we really need your support. I'm Mohammed Al Naeem, this is Decolonial Dispatch, and I'll see you next time.